Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you for the nice introduction. So, as Thomas said, today I'm going to talk about the automatic reaction network exploration with AMS-EON. AMS-EON is a new component in our AMS suite, which is available since the version 2021. So this is the outline of my talk. I'm going to give an introduction, just very general. And then I'm going to introduce the React project, which is very related to this matter because it's the main motivation of the idea. Then I'm going to describe how the PES exploration works in AMS, and I'm going to conclude with some illustrative examples. Okay, let's start. So if you Google automatic reaction pathways, the first thing that you are going to find is this diagram. So can you see my cursor?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. So this figure is really amazing. Let's say also beautiful, and it's taken from this web page and this book. If somebody is interested in more details, but the idea is that each dot here, each circle is a local minimum in a n-dimensional space, and the lines are reactions that are connecting these local minima. So this reaction network path is corresponds to the reaction, all the possible reactions starting for this system, which is the cobalt tetracarbonyl hydrate reacting with carbon monoxide, hydrogen, and ethylene. So this is not a huge system. It's really relatively small compared to for something that we need for industrial use. But even so, this system can get more than 2,600 and 600 local minima. It's a really huge network, and it really summarizes really well the level of complexity of this problem. So, in all these real applications, the final aim is to accurately predict the rate coefficients. But we always gonna face these incredibly complex systems. But in particular, we have a few problems that I highlighted here. So the first one, as I said, is the complexity of mapping all the possible reaction channels, like you can see here in this figure. The second one is that traditionally the way to proceed is to incorporate manual strategies, trying to use chemical intuition to design reactions. So you need a really great chemical knowledge for that. So the problem with that is that you are going to bias your results. Probably you are going to obtain what you were trying to see, and that's it. That's a huge problem. The last one is that normally all these to get these kind of diagrams, you need to calculate several ab initio parameters, typically energy, frequencies, geometries, and all these properties. They need electronic structure methods. For example, you can use DFT, or very simple like DFTP, or cheaper methods like ReactFF. But even so, the number of calculations that you need for this is huge, maybe millions of evaluations of energies forget the reaction mechanisms. So, it's necessary that we create tools to automatically search for reaction pathways, and of course calculate the corresponding reaction coefficients. And the aim is to do it without any human supervision. So in this slide, I include a table taken from this paper. There's a nice summary about it, a lot of methods for exploring reaction space in molecular systems. Sorry, and I'm not going to talk about all these methods, just to to show there are different approximations that we can use nowadays. In particular, I included 3 of them, which are the ones available in our AMS suite. But the point here is that most of these methods or schemes have originally developed for molecular systems. And as you can also see here, the underlying algorithms and concepts range from graph-based rules, like these ones, electronic wave function interpretations, and ab initio molecular dynamics, like, for example, TS-SCDS, nowadays called automaking or chemtracer in our suite. But all these algorithms, what they have in common is a goal of constructing all possible elementary steps for a given pool of reactants by locating the transition states, and all of them are relying on electronic structure methods. That is absolutely, so you need to use the electronic structure methods. So in our case, I include this, as I said, these 3 ones. AMS-EON is one of the options that we have in our suite to create these networks. For that, we need the reactants, and the method to explore the system is the dimer method. And also the way to discover the transition state is the same dimer method. For chemtracer is another option that was more designed as an analysis tool, that after dynamics, you can extract all the reaction that happened during the simulation. In principle, that from there, we can extract the information to obtain the transition states and the reaction rates. And finally, ACE reaction is another important component of our suite. But in this case, you need the reactants and products and use graph rules to predict which kind of reactions are going to happen. Also, we can combine this information to get the transition states and the kinetic constants, but this is work in progress. Okay, so if that is already complicated for molecular systems, in the case of catalytic processes in heterogeneous catalysis, it's even more complex. So in this figure, taken from this paper, I show the most simple one of the most simple reactions, just the oxidation of CO to produce CO2 on platinum 111. In this case, you can get, for this simple reaction, you can get more than 100 local minima and almost 600 transition states, all together describe the oxidation of CO. So for these catalytic processes on top of surfaces, normally the main problems associated are the structural variety and the size of the system. So because you need, so the computational part is more expensive. You need more electrons, more atoms to describe. Also, the vast amount of small transformation steps that need to be considered. So you can see here, for example, just for the CO and the O and the O2 on top of the platinum surface, you have several possible arrangements of these molecules that will give you different reaction rates to consider. Most of them are just diffusions, but they have different energies, different structures. They are completely different. Also, one of the big problems is that the surface can change its structure during the reaction. So you cannot simplify too much the surface in order to describe the reaction. And probably the last one is important, that is that all the structural arrangements during the reactions and surfaces significantly differ from their gas counterparts. So it means that, for example, in these cases where you have graph rules, they act like heuristics to predict the reactions. Those rules are going to be completely different when they take part in a surface. So you need to do probably new rules for every system, for every surface. So because of that, in SCM, we are participating in the REAXPRO project. Actually, it's coordinated by SCM. It's a really ambitious project in which several institutions are involved. Sorry. But the idea of this project is basically to go from the electronic and atomistic scales up to the real reactor size scale. And the idea is to create a single workflow that can go from here up to here in a fully automatic way without any human supervision. So it's a really ambitious project. And for that, we started with 4 different programs, the main components of the strategy. The first one is the AMS driver that is going to carry out all the electronic structure part. EON, which is going to explore the energy landscapes, and it requires to carry out thousands of these calculations with AMS to generate the reaction mechanisms. After that, we have SACROS, is a kinetic Monte Carlo method that uses the reaction mechanisms to calculate 2-number frequencies, or in other words, the number of molecules produced per unit time. So in the next part, catalytic foam is going to require, again, thousands of SACROS calculations to create these kind of landscapes for the TOF. In that way, it's going to be able to have all the information that is needed during the simulation of the real reactor. So I'm not going to talk about the whole project. I'm going to focus on this part, which is AMS and EON. And actually, since AMS 2021, AMS and EON are fully integrated at the code level. So now EON is inside AMS and is completely transparent for the AMS user how to use EON as normally used to use AMS. So what is EON? EON basically is a software package that contains a set of algorithms used primarily to model the evolution of atomic scale systems over long time scales. So something that is really nice in EON is it includes several algorithms, which are parallel replica dynamics, hyperdynamics, the adaptive kinetic Monte Carlo, which is the most robust method available there, and Bayesian hoping. So in the next week, Professor Johannes Johnson is going to talk about this more in detail. But this is like the kernel of our PES exploration. So let's see what how the PES exploration works in AMS. If somebody is familiar with the AMS inputs, basically we have a block called PES exploration with a lot of different properties or parameters. Here I'm just included 5 of them in order to explain how it works. So just imagine that you start from a local minimum in this energy landscape. So of course you don't know the energy landscape in advance, but the only thing that you know is this is a local minimum. So the first step is to use the diver method from EON to climb up in the energy landscape, trying to find all possible transition states around or close to this local minimum. So we have what we call explorers. Explorers are just independent calculations executing the same strategy. So using the diver method, here we have 3 explorers. These 2 just fail because they couldn't find a transition state, but probably one of them succeed in finding a transition state. Remember that all this exploration is completely random, so they can go anywhere basically. Once the transition state is located, the reactants and products are reconstructed just using a geometry optimization following the imaginary the mode with the imaginary frequency. It means that you are going to be able to detect this second local minimum. So with this local minimum, if you activated the dynamic seed states, it means that the new discovered local minima are going to act as a seed states. It means that the new set of explorers are going to start searching from there. So this loop is repeated up to the total number of expeditions. So here, these 3 explorers tried again. Only one of them succeed and found another local minimum connected with the transition state. So, for example, with this information, now we are able to construct these kind of diagrams, what we call the energy landscape diagrams, where we represent in black the local minima and in red the transition states, 2 for this case. There is, in principle, this is all we need, but there are some cases where there are no transition states associated. So, for example, if a molecule is just breaking apart, or gas molecule is separated from the surface, in some cases you don't have transition states, and we can include those cases using the calculation of fragments that they are going to be represented in our energy landscapes as a normal state, but actually you can access to the properties of each fragment independently from our graphical user interface. Okay, so more or less in general words how the PES exploration works. In our documentation, if you can go to the tutorial section, and in the structure and reactivity section, we are going to have 3 examples for this PES exploration. The first one is the automated reaction pathway discovery for hydrohalogenation. The second one is the cluster growth of cobalt clusters. And the third one is the water dissociation on an oxide surface. So please go there and try to explore all the properties of the program. But today I'm going to focus on this one, the first one. So the idea of this example is to confirm the Markovnikov's rule by discovering and comparing the reaction pathways for both formation of 1 chloropropane and 2 chloropropane. So this is the general reaction, and we have 2 possible products where we expect that the major which is produced is the 2 chloropropane. For that, you can just have to generate an initial structure, and in our graphical user interface, select as a job the process search, the number of expeditions, and the number of explorers, 50 and 32 respectively for this case. Of course, and enable the dynamic seed states as I showed in the previous slide. So with just that, you are going to have you're going to get an energy landscape like this. So normally the problem with this is that you receive a lot of information. You receive, in some cases, hundreds of different local minima and transition states, and you need to filter out the information that you really need. So with our graphical user interface, you can do that. I will show later. And also, if, for example, you decided to run the algorithm again, you can restart the calculation. Just given the folder's result of the previous calculation, and after that you can select which states you want to include in this new exploration, and which of them are going to be seed states. With all these options, after a couple of cycles, you can get the reaction that you were expecting, which is this one. You can see here, and you can remove states and just focus on the reaction that you wanted. So for this in particular case, we use a DFTB, and the results are quite similar compared to literature. And you can see that if the reaction goes through this transition state, the activation barrier is lower than if it goes to the other direction. So in some way, it confirms the Markovnikov rule for this system. Okay. Another interesting example is the splitting water on rutile titanium 110. I took this example from this paper, and it's the same idea. So you can also use these energy landscape exploration tools for solid states systems, and I'm gonna try to run this example. So can you see the GUI, the AMS GUI? Thomas? Okay, great, wonderful. Okay, here I just prepared the initial structure, and I just put the water molecule in some place randomly. I select the best exploration method using ReactFF with this force field, TO2 BOFF. In addition, just to speed up the calculations, I defined a surface region, and I fixed the position of the atoms in the surface to speed up the calculation. So with this in mind, in principle, you just have to define the number of expeditions, the number of explorers, enable the dynamic states option, and that's it. In principle, just you just have to run the system, execute the file. So you can see in AMS movie here, you can see how the simulation progressed. Oh, it failed. So let's see again. Oh no, it is here. So here, the energy landscape is going to be shown as is created during the simulation. On the left side, you have the molecule that you have highlighted here in the energy landscape. So in principle now, here, the explorers just found 3 different transition states. This one, here we are lucky. This one is the splitting of the water. You see, it went from the full water here, passing through this transition state, and then the water now is splitted. And you have a lot of different local minima around. So you can, for example, organize a little bit the energy landscape. You can play around with that. You can, for example, also check the vibrational spectrum for that particular state. Okay, it's a bit slow. Sorry for that. Let's try again. Here we go. You can see the vibrational frequencies for that system. You can analyze all the vibrational properties, and in particular, as I show, the reaction that we were interested in was this one. So we can basically just remove the rest, because these other reactions are basically the migration of the diffusion of the OH. So we can just ignore them for now. And finally, we can have our diagram. And if you want to see something more nice, you can reorient the molecules in the way that you like. And here we need, if we change this to electron volts, we recognize that using ReactFF, we need 0.45 electron volts to split water on top of this titanium dioxide. And also you can see that the prefactors are calculated there. So the prefactor in the going to the right hand is 10 to the 12, and on the in the opposite direction is 10 to the 11. And all these properties is what we normally want to explore from all the energy landscapes. Okay, that was that example. And this is the summary, where you can get the splitting of the water. So another property that we have in AMS-EON is the possibility to calculate the binding sites. So from a complete energy landscape, we can use that information to create the binding sites lattice. So for example, consider this example where this cluster, this is argon 13, and these are two additional argon atoms. This is a local minimum that goes through this transition state to create this outer configuration. That's basically just one of the atoms is diffusing on the cluster. So in this case, it's simple. The binding sites just correspond to the position of the atoms. And these two binding sites are considered connected because they are connected in this molecule. So in the other case, we just have the position of the binding sites. And regarding the transition state, we use this information to connect the additional binding sites. So basically, we have to merge the binding sites from the reactant and products, and then include the connections if there is a transition state in the middle. So here I would like to show this simple example. It's just the same argon 13 with an additional, this is argon 14 with an additional argon atom. And we can again create the energy landscape. And also we can have from here calculate the binding sites. Let me show the interface for the binding sites. So once you finish the calculation, if you enable the option to calculate the binding sites, you are going to have this option. So here you have all the binding sites and the connections. Remember that they correspond to transition states or reaction mechanisms connecting the points. So additionally, you have nice options, like for example, if you want to attach a molecule here, you can use, I don't know, let's say this ligand, that I like it. And you can include it here, there, and for example, run again the energy landscape exploration and find new binding sites, and so on. Here's a nice example to illustrate that. Okay. So additionally to these options, we also have a Python interface using Plums. Plums is a Python library, open source. It's available in GitHub. And thanks to this option, we can create complex workflows. For example, this is a workflow for the ReactXplore project that basically starts path exploration using some restraints for the molecules to avoid that the molecules just break apart. And in that way, we can get only those points where the molecules are attached to the surface. So in this way, we are going to generate an energy landscape. And this energy landscape can be used as an input for the second one, where we just remove the restraints. So at this point, we allow the system to react and produce simpler molecules. again, we're going to have another energy landscape that we can use, for example, for a refinement process using a different level of theory, or just using symmetry operators to generate the whole set of structures, like is in this case. So this is how this kind of Python input files looks like. Basically, you have to load the molecule in an XYZ format, then establish the properties of the calculation, create a job with a certain name, do the same for the other one. For example, here, the second job is going to depend of the execution of the first one. So this one is not going to be executed until the first one's finished. And that's it. You just have to start the jobs. So the system automatically take care of the dependencies, things like that. This option gives you the possibility to create really complex workflows. For example, for our React project, we are studying the CO oxidation on platinum. As I said, it's a really complex system, but our idea was to include certain restrictions, like, for example, you only consider the first no double n-body contributions, only single body contributions. And using this workflow, we were able to calculate, for example, automatically the binding sites lattice for the interaction with a single oxygen atom and platinum. This is simple. The CO also, the CO we found that the CO is not splitted with the interaction with the platinum. For example, with the O2, the O2 certainly is a more complex system, but we can get in the first step in the absorption, that the molecule is absorbed on a TBT configuration, and starting from there, you get the splitting of the oxygen, going to different points like FCC and bridge, FCC and FCC, and so on. Also for the CO2, you can get this kind of results. And here you can get the central reaction, which is the splitting of the CO2 in CO plus oxygen. And that's it. That's all I wanted to show today. And the idea is that the graphical user interface really gives you the option to generate the results, analyze them, just focus on the part of the energy landscape that you are really interested in. And it's really simple. So everybody is welcome to use the best exploration option. And thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nestor, for this very beautiful and interesting presentation. Yeah, so we're waiting for maybe some questions from the audience in the chat. In the meantime, maybe a question from my side. So you were talking about these three states, and just some comments. So in principle, this is a situation where you have some bounded species, and then the mode which is responsible for the distance to the bond holding it together. If that gets dissociated, it turns into this mode basically turns into some translational degree of freedom, right? So there's a transition between some harmonic or sort of harmonic vibration into what corresponds to the translation of the molecule itself, or the adsorbate, right? Are there any other situations where this could happen? Let's say you have some bonds which just dissociate or so, and also some inner dissociation or so, some ring breaks apart or so. Would you get the same picture then? Or is it then just not finding a transition state?
Yeah, it's really hard to predict when there is no transition state. So the best exploration is designed to find reaction, but only reactions that goes through a transition state.
So if there is no basically, yeah, some negative curvature and stationary state in between, then it does not detect that. It does not register that.
Exactly. yeah, those cases are not detected by our PES exploration. So in order to trying to fix this, we included the calculation of the fragmented states.
I see. Yeah, maybe some question from me to the audience. What did draw you into this talk? Where would you see applications of AMS-EON for your own research projects? And maybe, of course, Rosa and Ole, if you have any comments.
I can ask something.
Shoot right away.
So in one example, you showed there was clearly two reactions and then a bunch of conformers. Is it possible to collapse those conformers on top of each other if you don't want to see all that?
No, not currently. No, for this case, every conformer is going to have a different line in the energy landscape. So they are completely different systems.
Okay.
And probably they are connected by a transition state.
Yeah, this is true. So I understand that they should be on the PES, but they are then maybe to simplify the energy landscape visualization.
Yeah, with the AMC method that is not yet included in our PES exploration, available, but it's available in EON. You can group together all these states using right now I don't remember the name, a coarse graining approximation.
Okay.
This is really nice. So probably the Professor Johannes is gonna talk about that. The Professor Hans Johnson is gonna talk about that. It's but there is an option to do that.
Maybe also to add to that, so when Rosa asks about conformers, in principle, that is some rotation around the bond, right? Corresponding to some local symmetry, at least. To add to that, is there any kind of mechanism by which it respects general symmetries? So.
Oh yes, that's something that I forgot to say. But our landscape exploration, you have to enable that option. But if two molecules are related by a symmetry operation, they are considered the same.
Okay, so then you would basically have two different molecules of the same type, and if they align in the right way that corresponds to the symmetry, then they are considered identical, or like symmetry identical at least.
Exactly. So you can in some way reduce the complexity of the linear landscape, just including only the irreducible representation of the energy landscape.
And not sure if you covered that. So what happens if you have a bigger molecule on that surface? So if there's something beyond CO or so.
Yeah. So in principle, if you have a clue of which atoms are the active ones, you can use the method only on those atoms, and just allow to relax the rest of the atoms adiabatically. So in that way, you can use big molecules, but just focus on the atoms that you really are interested in.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Wonderful. I've seen that ReXFF was used a bit for these wonderful examples, and linking a bit to what we discussed in the last few webinars. It seems to me like this would be just perfect for generating training data also for force field training. Do you know if there's is the way that params and EON can talk together? Like to export all the structures from an EON search and plug them into params and then fit something and feed the new force field back to EON or so?
Yeah, absolutely. That's in principle possible. Yeah, yeah. The phase exploration can be used just to fit params. Yeah.
Yeah, there's
Wonderful.
so usually I tried this at some point, or like I did some exploratory calculations. Maybe to add to that, for what is necessary is usually that you would need to sample out a little bit more of the reaction path than just the minima and the transition state in between. And the other thing is because this usually you have some flips in the electronic structure around the transition state, right? Usually some bonds breaks. Sometimes the multiplicity changes or so. It seems to be the way to go to do that with plane wave codes, because they provide a bit more of a, let's say, evenly spread basis, or a generally larger basis, if you will. And that seems to matter in that case. Also, you have a bit of an easier time to enable smearing and things like that. So usually one would do that within AMS than with Quantum Espresso and the interface we have for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't see any questions from the audience today. So well, I hope it was still helpful. In either case, yeah, you can reach us, of course, for follow-up questions via the usual communication channels, so email or so, or also contact the support if there are some questions regarding that, or some things which were unclear. Yeah, then I think we're gonna conclude this session a little bit earlier today. As already said, there will be recordings of this made available probably within the next few days, and then with adjusted subtitles a few days after that on the YouTube playlist for this AMS and Science 2022 webinar series. And yeah, with that, I would like to conclude the session and wish everybody a pleasant rest of the day.